Hello and welcome back to Something Z, and welcome to What If Deku Had a Crying Quirk Part 6. Last time on the What If, Izuku, Ida, and Todoroki fought the hero killer and survived. So let's jump back into the What If. Days after the incident, school started back up again, and when they got back, the final exams began, and everyone gets the same written scores as they do in the canon for both the practice and the actual exam. So we skip to when it's time for the student physics teacher's test, and all of the groups will be the exact same, and will end the same way. So we skip to when it's time for All Might versus Izuku and Bakugo. The way the fight begins is by Bakugo flying straight at All Might, and Izuku runs after Bakugo, telling him to stop and to come up with an actual plan. And before the two could react, there seemed to be a huge wave of wind, and it was so strong that it tore up the road through the whole practice city, and it threw them a couple of feet away. And when they get back up, All Might is standing right in front of them, and when he sees him, Bakugo launches himself at All Might and blasts All Might in the face, but it didn't seem to affect the number one hero. And he grabbed onto Bakugo's face and he slammed him into the ground, and Izuku tried to retreat, but All Might appeared right behind him, and then he grabbed him by his legs and threw him a few feet away. And Bakugo got back up to fight All Might, and he did this a couple of times. And when Izuku got back to where they were, the number one hero grabbed a piece of fence and pinned Izuku to the ground. And he punched Bakugo in the gut so hard he gets launched, and he even throws up a bit. And when Bakugo starts to get back up, All Might grabs him by the face, and they talk about Izuku's improvements. And that's when Bakugo said that he would rather lose than team up with Izuku, in which Izuku punches Bakugo in the face and grabs him and brings him into an alleyway. And after a bit of time, they eventually started to come up with a plan. And while they were coming up with a plan, All Might was looking for them. And before he could react, Bakugo jumps out of the alleyway and launches an explosion at All Might, point blank. But it was only a distraction, and before he could react, Izuku jumped behind him, and he had Bakugo's glove filled with his sweat, and he pulled the pin, releasing a huge explosion. But that was also a distraction as well, and before the attack, Izuku sprayed his eyes with the onion spray, and he gave Bakugo nose plugs, and he wiped his tears on both of his gloves. So we jump back to the present, and while All Might is still slowed down from the blast, Izuku used full cowling, brought both of his hands in front of All Might's face, and wiped one hand under All Might's eyes and one under his nose. And after he did those two swipes, he jumped on All Might's stomach, and he and Bakugo started to run towards the exit. And All Might tries to run after them, which he was able to catch up with them easily. But everything was blurry, and the only way he could see them is the color of their hair and outfits. And he stood right in front of Bakugo, and he grabbed him by the face and slammed him into the ground again. And Izuku, seeing this, runs back and punches All Might in the face, and he grabs Bakugo and runs to the exit, making them both pass the finals. And sometime after the final, Aizawa tells them that they will all be going to the summer camp, and if you failed the exams, then you would just have to do extra training during the camp. And after class 1A decided that they wanted to go shopping together, and the same things happened, and eventually Izuku ended up by himself. And just then, a hand wraps around his neck, and some guy in a hood talks about how he remembers Izuku from the sports festival and the USJ. And what made Izuku realize who this person was when he said the word again when he talked about the USJ. And Izuku finally recognized the man's hair. He was the hand guy who led the attack. And he threatens Izuku that if he does anything, then he will use his quirk to kill him and as many people as he can around them. And when Izuku hears this, he complies, and they have a talk about the hero killer. And eventually Shigaraki comes to the conclusion that All Might is at the center of all of his problems. And right after he saw this, Ochako came back, and when he saw her, he let go of Izuku and walked into the crowd. And the same things happened, so the mall was shut down, and the police had to keep Izuku for questioning. So we skip to when Class 1A is at a cliff in the woods, and there they meet the WWPC, and they are thrown off the cliff, and they are told to get to the camp as quick as possible. And when they get there, everyone's beaten, tired, and dirty. And the same things happen, and Izuku learns about Koto's parents, and how they are killed by a villain, and how now he doesn't like heroes. So we skip to the next day, and since Izuku had two different quirks, they split the time of each practice, so he spent around 9 hours doing sparring practice fighting Tiger. And for his crying quirk, since he can't actually control the chemicals in his tears, he has to train on things he can control, like the amount or how long he can keep his eyes open, so he doesn't have to rely solely on the onion spray. And by the end of the day, Izuku was tired of being from the fighting, and he was covered in dry tears, and his eyes were red from dryness. And while they were eating dinner, Izuku realized that Koto wasn't there, so he went to go look for him, and he eventually found him hanging out on a cliff, and they had the same talk, and eventually Izuku leaves Koto on the cliff, leaving him some food. So we skip to the next day at sunset, and when they complete their day's worth of training, and then they were told that they will be doing a test of courage. And while Izuku was waiting for his turn to go in by himself, everyone noticed the smell of smoke, and when they look, they see the forest is covered in blue flames. And when they were distracted, that's when the villains started to attack. And before Izuku left with the other students, Izuku remembered that Koda is probably on the cliff, so he uses One for All and runs to the cliff as quickly as possible. And by the time he gets there, Koda is already face to face with Muscular, and he was about to be punched, but Izuku was able to grab him in time. But he dropped his phone and it got crushed under Muscular's fist. And now that his phone is gone, he can't call for backup, and he stands in front of Koda and swears that he will protect him. The two then go back and forth, with Muscular seeming to be too strong for Izuku to fight. But for the whole fight, Izuku had his eyes open, and when he finally gets a tear, he wipes it on the side of his hand, and he wipes it under Muscular's face, and then he does a 100% smash, creating a huge blast, almost launching Koda off the cliff. But Izuku was able to catch him in time, but Muscular wasn't down for too long. And after a minute, he got back up, and he used his quirk to the maximum, and he started to crush Izuku, even though he's blind to an extent. And before Izuku got fully crushed, Koda used his quirk and sprayed Muscular in the face, distracting him for a second. And that moment of weakness was long enough for Izuku to start to get back up and use One for All. And with one Delaware Detroit smash, he was able to punch Muscular into the mountain, knocking him out. And Izuku comes up with a plan right afterward, which was he put some tears on the palm of Koda's hands. Then Koda would use his quirk and spray the chemical all over Muscular, so that when he wakes up, it will make it so he can't see, and thus not a threat. After some time, Izuku with Koda on his back runs through the forest, until he eventually sees Aizawa, who takes Koda. And he also tells Izuku to tell a message to Mandalay, and after a couple minutes he was able to make it to where she was, and that's when he tells her that Aizawa is allowing the students to fight, and that the villains are after Bakugo, in which she sends a telepathic message telling everyone the news. After he hears the news, he runs into the woods to look for Bakugo, even after she tells him not to. And after a bit of time running, Izuku comes across one of Shoji's body parts, and seconds later he gets pushed by Shoji, and when he looks to see why, he sees Dark Shadow out of control. And while they were running out of the way of Dark Shadow's attack, Shoji explains what happened, and they eventually come up with a plan to both try and save Tokoyami and Bakugo. So they start to run looking for Bakugo, and they use Shoji's quirk as bait, until they eventually find Bakugo and Todoroki, and they were fighting the villain Moonfish. And with one hit from Dark Shadow, Moonfish was launched into a tree and he was knocked out. Then Todoroki and Bakugo used their quirk to weaken Dark Shadow until Tokoyami was able to get control again. After some discussion, they decided to walk towards the camp together in order for Bakugo to get to camp as safely as possible. And after a bit of walking, they come across Sue stuck to a tree and Ochako getting pinned by someone and getting her blood drained. And when the person sees the group, she jumps off of her and walks into the forest, and for some weird reason she's blushing. And after Zuko explains that they will lead Bakugo back to camp, Ochako tells them that Bakugo isn't behind them. And when they look behind them, she is correct, and Tokoyami is gone as well. And then they hear someone speak, and when they find the source of the sound, it was coming from the trees above them. And it was coming from someone in a coat and a top hat, and they had a mask that covered their face. And he said that he took Bakugo and Tokoyami, and then he holds 2 blue marbles in his hand. Then he runs away in the trees, and he was able to dodge all of their attacks. And the group comes up with the same plan as in the canon, so the guys launch themselves with the help of Ochako and Sue, and they land on Mr. Compress in the middle of a clearing. And after a bit of time being on the ground, Mr. Compress turned himself into a marble and threw himself. And that's when Dabi launched a wave of blue flames, and it burned Izuku and Shoji a bit. And when Mr. Compress turned back to normal, he had 2 blue marbles in his mouth, which were Tokoyami and Bakugo. And before he could react, he got hit in the face by a naval blazer out of nowhere, losing the 2 marbles. Shoji was able to grab one of the marbles, and Todoroki was running to grab the other one, but it was grabbed by Dabi. Then Mr. Compress undid his quirk to make sure it was Bakugo, which it was. Then the villain started to leave through the portal, and Izuku rushed to save Bakugo, but it closed on him before he could get there. So now the villains have Bakugo in their possession. And that's where I'm going to leave the What If. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you next time on Something Z.